Hello and welcome to episode 25 of MMO Weekly, presented as always by MetsMerizedOnline.com. I'm your host, Sal Manzo, along with my co-host and MMO executive editor, Mike Mayer. And we're joined once again by friend of the show, SMY's Jacob Resnick. Jacob, thanks a lot for joining us again, man.
Yeah, of course. I'm gunning for the record for most guest appearances. So I've got to be up there already, right?
Listen, we don't want to say anything, under the table money, things like that. But we'll talk after the show. We'll make your third guest here. We'll see if we can work some magic. But
Yeah.
Obviously we have you here talking off season. Things have besides Diaz haven't really gone too crazy for the Mets just yet. A lot of pending free agents. A lot of talk about a lot of different players. So I guess we'll talk. We'll start with Mike. A couple of players from Japan that the Mets are apparently scouting after. One of them is starting pitcher Kodai Senya. Personally, I don't know much about him, but I was hoping if you can kind of, give us, shed some light on kind of the players that the Mets are looking at there, some comps, and maybe what you can expect if they do, get posted to a major league team.
Yeah, so Senga is 29 and starting pitcher from Japan, and he's a guy that throws hard. He sits around 97, 98, but he's been up to 102 with his fastball. His secondary pitch is, depending on who you talk to, they call it different things, but the ghost forkball is what they like to call it. It's kind of like a mixture between a forkball and a splitter, and it kind of just dives and dies, and it's tough to hit. He also throws a slider, curveball, and a cutter. I mean, that's pretty typical of a Japanese pitcher to kind of use the whole ensemble. So pitched really well this year, ERA under 2, 144 innings, which is quite a bit over in Japan when they only play 128 games. He's posted. He's not posted. He's old enough so you don't have to post him or whatever. So he's a free agent right now. He could sign today. The only issue that people have seen with him is walks. They're kind of concerned about walks. He's 3.0 there this year, and obviously you kind of wonder about that going up in the major leagues. So that's kind of the concern. I think MLB trade rumors, their prediction was 5 years, $75 million. So with that, you're looking, that's basically that's like number 3 starter in the big leagues. That's essentially what you're going to pay total. Average annual value, that's less. Chris Bassett's probably going to get more per year than that, but less money. So that's kind of what you're looking at, is that type of deal. That feels kind of similar to John Gray type deal that he got. So yeah, the Mets heavily scouted him in Japan. I don't think, from John Morosi, who's been kind of reporting on Senga, and a couple other folks, they haven't specifically said the Mets. People I talked to just said that the Mets liked him and they scouted him. So we know that the Mets need starting pitching. And another interesting note, his agent, Jim Wolf, during the GM meetings, said that he wants to play for a big market team. He wants to play for a win now team. And he's interested in analytics. He's kind of scratched the surface there, and he's interested to more get into the biometrics and that type of stuff. And he wants to learn about that stuff. So, the Mets cross off all 3 of those. Obviously, we're a big market team, built to win now, and they have one of the biggest analytic groups in baseball now. So from that aspect, it's certainly a fit. And from the point that the Mets need a starting pitcher, it's certainly fit. And I think, you got DeGrom and Verlander and Rodon, and then after that, it kind of goes to that next tier, and I think he's right in that next tier.
Just going to add real quick that, Mike said, you've kind of got to pounce on the top of the starting pitching market, or else you're kind of going to be scrambling and looking at the trade market, which I know we might get into in a little bit, but it's not really something I can envision the Mets kind of making a big splash move for a starting pitcher. The one thing that I think is an interesting aspect of it is obviously we know Billy Epler was the GM who signed Shohei Ohtani from the Angels, and that's been discussed a little bit, but obviously not that Senga is quite at that level, but it just kind of shows that Epler is familiar with that market. He's scouted Ohtani in person, so he kind of knows what the culture of the Japanese baseball is like, and can kind of maybe a little better than some other GMs kind of predict how he would adjust to Major League Baseball in the States, because we know that's kind of the biggest thing. It's not how talented is this guy, it's more how is he going to adjust to living in a new country, and pitching in a different hitting environment, and with is the baseball still different? I think maybe slightly different. So it's all an adjustment. So that's pretty much most of the equation is how is this guy gonna translate to the majors. So I think the Mets are as well suited as anyone to kind of test those waters with Epler, who's kind of experienced in that regard.
Yeah, and I think another important note is to just how it's kind of changed the last 2 years since Steve Cohen took over, how the Mets have kind of been more active in just scouting in these areas, in Asia, Cuba, different spots where they just weren't scouting to the degree that they are now. And they've done a much better job of that the last 2 years. And again, that's another money thing. That's a thing that comes from Cohen's pocket, being able to have more scouts to go overseas and see all these players. Baseball is getting more and more global, and you're finding players in different spots. So it's good for the Mets to be able to pick from those guys.
Yeah, and as far as the comment you made, Jake, it's just as far as the risk factor, as far as different baseball in Japan, obviously having to come to a new continent, a new country, and get comfortable in that kind of thing. It may not success may not necessarily translate to the stuff. So I was wondering, and I'll pose this to both of you, but Jacob, I want to hear you first. It's just, do you think that the Mets are in a position? Obviously, it's going to be a totally different roster. We know that for 2023, but it's still win now mode, right? The team is still in. Cohen and company is still in the mode of trying to win right this second. So would you be more apt to take a chance on a player like Senya from Japan, or as opposed to the money that you're kind of talking sounds a little bit close to the comps to what maybe Taijuan Walker is going to get something in that area? Or would you rather than put that investment towards a Walker and or a Bassett of pitchers that pitch in this market, have had some success and have already pitched at the major league level? I'm just kind of curious what your thoughts there on that. I'll start with you, Jacob.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think personally, if hypothetically I was in that position, I'd probably lean towards, the safer bet. When you're talking about a guy who's one of the top pitchers that have come out of Japan the last few years, he's going to command a big contract. So yeah, you have to make that determination. Do we want to commit long-term to someone who's, kind of an unknown, and the range of outcomes is pretty wide. I mean, we've seen obviously Ohtani, we've seen what he can do, and we've seen guys like, Yusei Kikuchi come from Japan and just not really have the same success. I mean, he's kind of had an up and down career in the States so far, but so yeah, I mean, and I don't, maybe some people will say it's kind of overrated, kind of knowing a guy like Walker or Bassett, guys that you're familiar with. But I think that's pretty significant, because so much of building the culture and building your team is the relationships you have with these guys and the relationships with the coaching staff. We know, obviously, Buck and Jeremy Hefner, they're all still here. So they're guys that they're both Walker and Bassett are familiar with. So I personally would lean to the more, surefire, as far as what you're getting from those guys when you're talking about bigger contracts. Like, Bassett is going to probably command a pretty sizable contract. But yeah, that's just kind of a personal thing.
Yeah, and I'm kind of the opposite of Jacob. I think in this particular instance, I think Senga has bigger upside than Bassett and Walker in the short term. And the long term, he's a little bit he's younger than Bassett, and he's around the same age as Walker. But I think, I mean, you get him over here working with Hefner, the new development coach, Eric Yeagers, and getting him into kind of shaping his pitches different, working on his command, different stuff like that. I think this is a guy that could be a number 2. So you have that 2 upside, but that's part of the risk though too, is getting a guy from Japan. How many times can you get a guy with potentially a 2 upside for 5 years, $75 million? That's really cheap per year to be able to get that upside. So I think that's kind of where you have to factor in, and maybe the timing isn't right for the Mets, because it definitely sounds like Senga is going to sign pretty early. There's a lot of teams interested. He's in the States right now. So maybe that's something he just wants to get done. early in the offseason. And that might not be the right timing for the Mets because they want to get DeGrom figured out. And then if they don't sign DeGrom, then kind of go down the dominoes. I don't think you want to do that completely because if you wait around for DeGrom, you might lose out on a bunch of options. So it's tough for the Mets because they have to kind of, I mean, we keep coming back to this, but they just have so many pieces, and you kind of have to, I mean, they're not just going to spend $500 million. So you have to kind of figure out little pieces where you're going to spend this much on that starter and this much on that starter and a center fielder and your bullpen. And it's going to be a constant flux because once a domino falls, say like Brandon Nimmo signs somewhere else, then you're kind of completely adjusting your plan because there's no $130 million center fielder on the market. So it's a completely different plan. And with DeGrom, it's kind of the same thing. Rodon is probably the only pitcher that's going to get like similar total contract to him. So, I mean, you could talk about that, or Justin Verlander maybe a little bit too, but it changes because there's only so many people that are in the same regard as DeGrom. Like, I mean, Verlander's close, I would say, and then Rodon is still he's a question mark because he's had injuries too. So it's really tough to nail down exactly how they're going to do that rotation. And I know we're going to kind of jump into that when we talk about trades.
Yeah, and real quick, we are, I wanted to touch a little bit. I know Andrew Heaney's been linked to the Mets a little bit. The Mets apparently over the last couple of days talking to the Rays about some starters. But before we get there, Mike, you alluded to it, and I just want to get both of your points real quick. You talked about just kind of how they're handcuffed as far as with what's going to happen with DeGrom here. How much of a factor is it in the sense that the Mets really kind of in the starting pitching market, are holding back or, not maybe being aggressive on other pitchers, so to speak, because they are waiting on DeGrom? And, when is that, I guess, sweet spot for the Mets to say, all right, you're not signed yet, but things aren't, we're not any closer. So, we're not necessarily going to move on, but we have to fill our rotation here for a season. I just wonder, like, what the middle ground is for this. It's so difficult. Jacob, I'll start with you.
As you were saying that, sounded a lot like the Mets' reasoning for signing James McCann a couple years ago instead of JT Realmuto, which we now know it was kind of not true based on the latest reporting. And, Tim Healy did some stuff on that during the World Series. But yeah, I mean, playing the market is as much a part of free agency as just simply signing guys. But it's a tough question. I think, DeGrom, you kind of you have no choice but to make him the focal point of your offseason. Like if he, like, I can't see the Mets coming out looking good if they let DeGrom go somewhere else. As much as Mets fans, have come to love Steve Cohen and everything he's done so far, it's going to be tough if they let DeGrom walk. So I don't think they're ever going to reach a point with him. I mean, unless it's like down to the, he's where DeGrom's agent tells the Mets, like, yeah, we're signing somewhere else tomorrow unless you give us like, I don't think there's ever a point where the Mets are going to walk away from DeGrom to go for, just looking at the list of names, Jameson Taillon, like they're not going to pivot to something lesser just because they're kind of slow moving on the DeGrom front. That's at least what I'd assume.
Yeah. And I think with the Mets, which is why we're hearing about like Andrew Heaney trading for someone from the Rays, a couple other arms like Nathan Eovaldi. I think he's kind of been loosely tied to the Mets too. Different arms like that. I think that's why you're hearing more about them, because I think the Mets would, it would make a lot of sense if they could go out and sign their number 3 starter, their number 4 starter before anything happens with DeGrom, so that, if you do lose DeGrom, you have kind of these guys to fall back on to make sure you have some pitching depth. Because right now you're talking about it's Max Scherzer, Carlos Carrasco, David Peterson, Tyler McGill, and Joey Lucchesi. if we're to start the season tomorrow, that's what their rotation looks like. So, I mean, they have to sign 3 starters, you would think, or at least 2 starters and like a really strong bullpen. And Peterson's in the starting rotation, something to that accord. But either way, they got to get some high-end starters. So I think you would kind of try to, if you have a sense that DeGrom's going to wait it out and kind of see what he can get out there, I think you got to be aggressive on someone like a Bassett. Heaney, we talked about Heaney's kind of a different. I feel like Heaney's more of a depth piece than anything else.
Right.
I mean, he pitched really well for the Dodgers last year. I mean, his Ks per 9 inning were up around 13, but he's also pitched 78 innings in a good year for him. So, I mean, that feels like more of your upside 4 or 5 starter, which is, I mean, that's essentially what they did with Taijuan Walker, and that kind of worked out for them. So those are the types of guys you have to sign, and it wouldn't be a bad thing if they struck a deal with Heaney or someone of that ilk early on, so that they do have that depth to fall back onto if they don't get DeGrom. And from people I've talked to, I think it was last week it came out, Odds Check USA had the Mets as the favorite to sign Justin Verlander if he didn't go back to Houston. And people are like, the initial response is like, holy shit, no way. This guy's so old and like this type of thing. And didn't really see it as possible. I think the people I've talked to, the Mets like Justin Verlander, and they see him as a good backup if they can't get DeGrom. Obviously, I think that's what it would be. I can't imagine them signing, like having Scherzer and then signing Verlander and DeGrom. That's a lot of pitching, and not particularly like young pitching. That's a lot of money there. But I think they have real interest in Verlander, and despite his age, could win. I mean, he was one of the best pitchers in the American League this year. He was really good. And I know people point to, well, he stunk in the playoffs and this type of thing. I mean, he still came up and won the biggest game that the Astros needed to win this year. And if Verlander's your backup option, I mean, that's not terrible. The Mets have certainly done a lot worse in recent years getting depth pitching. So, I think there's real interest there in Verlander. That kind of depends on what happens with DeGrom.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's funny, right? You know, Verlander's about to be, all things considered, probably going to be the AL Cy Young Award winner for this year. It's about to be 39 or 40, but missed 2 years, with the Tommy John. That was 2 years, less wear on the tires. World Series wise, he doesn't have a great record, but, honestly, if the Mets make the World Series, I don't think anybody's going to complain. So, if they can get to that point, that's great. But, if you can replace one future Hall of Famer with another, I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. Again, it just goes to everything that we're talking, just as far as there's no real youth there, wouldn't be there. I'm sure it would be like a 1-2 year deal kind of thing to win right now. But that's a nice backup plan to have. You hope that it's obviously not the case because you want DeGrom. But if something like that did happen, it's nice to see that the Mets are in on a player of that caliber and, are looking to regroup. But, like we're talking, it's kind of they're in a rock and a hard place that you want to bring DeGrom back, but you also got to fill up half a roster. So it's going to be very interesting to see how this fall and this winter rolls along, because who knows if DeGrom's going to sign early, wait it out, and the Mets are going to be in a weird spot. But, I'll transition from kind of that to obviously talking about an Andrew Heaney type. You touched on a little bit. So, Jacob, I'll start with you. Just your thoughts on him. If you think that's a fit or not. Obviously, had a stint with the Yankees that didn't go well. Pitched well for the Dodgers last year. But, just were, curious as far as if you think he'd be someone the Mets could pan out here.
Yeah, I mean, I think I pretty much agree with what Mike said, that you got to look at him as a depth starter option. Kind of like what Taijuan Walker was when they first signed him 2 years ago. Like you're not relying on him to be one of the top guys in your rotation. Obviously, injuries kind of pushed him to be that from time to time, but you can't go in with Andrew Heaney as your number 2 starter behind Max Scherzer. I think the interesting thing is Billy Epler has a long history with him from the Angels.
Mm-hmm.
He was solid at the beginning of his tenure there, and then things turned sour pretty quickly. I just like wonder what Epler's perception of him as a pitcher is. Is it like he's, is it his perception tainted by what, he saw towards the end of his Angels career, or is it like, okay, this guy completely reinvented himself by going to the Dodgers? I would hope that whatever the Dodgers unlocked with him, with his, slider and being able to use that pitch more, is like something the Mets are capable of maintaining and kind of extending, just because they're not really they're trying to get to the point where they're that team that picks up the guy and makes the tweak and unlocks something from a guy. So I just would be interested to see kind of what, obviously we won't hear from Epler on him unless they actually do sign him, but just kind of what his perception is on him. I think it'd be pretty interesting.
Yeah, and I mean, like Jacob touched on most of it. I mean, it's basically a depth type of guy where you're hoping to get like 120 innings out of the back end of your rotation. And I mean, there's upside there. I think Major League trade rumors, I think they had him at 3 years, $42 million. That feels a little high for that type of guy. I mean, that's obviously a little more than you'd kind of hope for that back end guy. But who knows? The early deals, I mean, when Diaz's deal came out, 5 years, $102 million, people were kind of like, wow, like that's Mets had to do it. They got it done, and that was a lot of money. And then as more details of his deal came out with the deferrals and the signing bonus and stuff like that, and how that actually translates to what the Mets are paying him for luxury tax purposes for a year, it looks much better. And then you see what Suarez got from the Padres, which was quite a bit of money for a guy. And then you see what old friend Rafael Montero got, 3 years, $34.5 million. I think people are shocked by that deal. So it makes it look like the deal that the Mets gave for Diaz even better, but also kind of gives you an idea of pitching is going to be expensive this offseason. If Rafael Montero, for his years of 30, I think it's 32 to 34, his age that he's going to be in that deal, if he's getting $11 million a year, pitching is going to be very expensive, whether it's in the bullpen and the rotation, and the Mets have to fill both. So it'll be interesting to see once we kind of get the first starter that signs one any length, like 3-4 years, and kind of what they're getting per year to kind of set the market, because that's what the Mets they're going to end up paying for. I mean, people are talking about like $12-13 million, $14 million maybe for Taijuan Walker. And I think that's low. I think a guy like Walker is going to end up getting like 16-17 million. And I think Bassett's going to be a little higher than that too. So pitching's going to be expensive, and the bullpen's going to be expensive. I mean, look at Adam Ottavino. He's going to turn in that 1 year, $4 million deal from the Mets into a nice little 2-year deal for probably like $20 million, something like that. So it'll be interesting to see where the market for the pitching keeps going, and the deals that are put out there. I mean, the Mets are going to have to spend quite a bit to fill out those pitching spots.
Yeah, and that's, I think, a good segue as far as to, Mets talking with the Rays. Obviously, like you're talking, the starting pitching market's going to be heavy as far as free agents. Mets are going to have to make some trades, whether it's for, starting pitching or in the bullpen. And apparently they've, been speaking to the Rays about pitching in general. I'm going to stick on the starter side for now. Two guys that obviously jump out to me, Shane McClanahan and Tyler Glasnow. Just kind of your thoughts on either one of those dudes, what a package you think would take to get either one of them, and if you had a preference between, either of those two guys. Jacob, I'll start with you.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important for Mets fans especially to just kind of be clear that report, I don't think, was suggesting anything close to those kind of guys, a Glasnow or a McClanahan. Like, it's obviously it's worth talking about with the Rays. The second any pitcher, me and Mike were talking about just before we went on, the second any pitcher, gets into their arbitration years, their at risk of being traded away from the Rays. So yeah, I mean, I love both of those pitchers, and certainly think, if they are available, then you see what's out there. But just kind of referring to that report specifically, I think you're looking at more of the depth guys, kind of at the back of the Rays plans, whether it's someone like Yanni Chirinos or Luis Patino. Because the Rays are in the enviable position of having too many players for their 40-man roster ahead of the deadline on Tuesday, which is today when everyone's listening to this, to protect guys from the 40-man roster. So they've got to make some trimmings there. And I think, and honestly, if the Mets can pick up someone like a Yanni Chirinos, he's had some injuries, but he's had success in the past, to not put him in a role where you're like, okay, this is our Ottavino replacement, or our Bassett replacement, but like maybe your Trevor Williams replacement, like, a guy who's going to eat innings, that I don't think anyone's talked about that so far, that like the Mets need to replace what Trevor Williams did for them this year. And whether that's, replacing him in the bullpen or replacing him in a starter, like that's production that they got this past year that they need to replace. So yeah, I think it'll be interesting. Yeah, definitely don't think the Mets are going to end up making a move for either of those two guys, but yeah, you never know.
Yeah, I don't see McClanahan going anywhere. There's no motivation to trade him now. Glass now, I could see a little different because he's going to make $25 million in 2024. So the Rays obviously aren't going to pay him that. And once you get closer to that deal, the team's kind of getting less value out of it. He's only making a little over $5 this year. So I could see him being in the conversation, but I think they're more so like looking at Ryan Yarbrough, Jalen Beeks, Chirinos that Jacob mentioned. Brooks Raley is another one, Jeffrey Springs. I mean, they have a lot of cheap arms that have had success at the major league level. Again, like Jacob said, you're not replacing like a Chris Bassett or an Adam Ottavino or anything, but they have 5 or 6 quality arms that you could get for, I mean, a lot of these guys you're going to have for like 2 years. A couple of them would be 3 years. So yeah, it makes sense to get into these discussions. I mean, they're going to make multiple trades, like Jacob said too. I think is it 8 spots, Jacob? It's something crazy like that because they're right up against the 40, and they have like 7 to 8 surefire prospects that they have to add, or they're going to lose them in the Rule 5. So I mean, the Rays, even more so than other teams, they're going to make sure they're going to push out those guys that are making $2, $3, $4 million a year, get them off that 40-man roster and shuffle those prospects in like they do. I mean, they seemingly do it all the time where they just trade off guys and then somehow they're still winning 90 games a year. So, I mean, it's kind of tough to argue with what they're doing, but other teams reap the benefits too. I mean, some of the guys they've traded over the last couple of years have worked out. I mean, Ryan Stanek has ended up with the Astros and he's pitched well. They've had some other guys that they traded and pitched pretty well after leaving them. So yeah, I mean, it makes sense for the Mets too, because if you're going to make a trade, you want to try to get someone that's controllable. And there's just no way that they can fill all these needs through free agency. So at some point they're going to make a trade, and the Rays are in a spot where they have to make these trades in the next, when people listen to this, 8 hours ish. So, yeah, it's a good spot for the Mets, like we talked about before, to go in there and make sure that they get some depth pieces. And I think that's a really good point by Jacob with Trevor Williams too, is we talk about like Ottavino and Lugo and Walker, Bassett, all these guys that are free agents. But I mean, Trevor Williams pitched 80 innings this year and his ERA was just above 3. So, I mean, that's a lot of pretty darn good major league innings that you have to replace. And that's tough to do. I mean, it's tough to find a guy that's able to do what he did and spot start. Because that's what they had with Lugo until he went straight to the pen. And So we might as well talk about Seth Lugo. Find it pretty interesting that I think it's
Sal, Mike is coming for your hosting job.
It's a smooth transition. That's why he's the co-host.
But yeah, so Lugo, there's been around 12, 13 teams that have called Seth Lugo, and some reason the Mets are not one of them. Some teams are showing interest in Lugo as a starter, which we know that he's always wanted to do. That's how he kind of started his Mets career in the big leagues, and then he kind of got into this bullpen role. He was a 2-inning guy for a while, and now he's kind of just Buck used him in a bunch of different spots, but just used him when he needed to, and used him against lefties because Lugo's been really effective against lefties. But yeah, I find it really, I guess, curious is the best word, that the Mets are so starving for pitching, and one of their own guys is out there is very good this year, and they just haven't contacted him. I don't know if that's just because they know, well, he's going to sign as a starter for some team, and that's not where we see him. So let's just stay out of that market. But it's I don't understand not talking to him, I guess, is the point. And maybe they end up doing it. But, I mean, at this point, with him getting this deep in the market, them not talking to him, and other teams already showing interest as a starter, I got to believe Lugo's gone. And again, that's another 65, 70 innings of quality baseball that you have to replace.
Yeah, I think, like you said, number one, if he's being looked at as a starter, and it's just pretty clear that's not what the Mets view him as. It's unfortunate because he's pitched well, but you can't really do anything about that if he's only going to sign with a team that's going to guarantee him a starting role. The other element to it, maybe he's just kind of run his course as a Met, and it just kind of happens, especially with relievers, more so than other guys. It's just, not that he's been bad for them. I mean, he's not as kind of lockdown elite as he had been in previous years. 2019 in specific. But it's just, maybe it's just not someone who they see as a piece that they need to have going forward. And as long as they have targets lined up to replace him and to go after instead of him, I don't see it as a huge deal. I mean, I don't think compared to DeGrom and Nimmo and Bassett, I think he's more in the Walker category of like, yeah, it'd be nice to re-sign him, but like, he's not a guy you move your entire offseason and, around to bring him back. Whereas those other three guys, maybe Bassett less so than Nimmo and DeGrom, like those are the guys you have to go after. Or else, you kind of have to start scrambling to fill some holes. So I don't really have any issues with them deciding that, he's not the guy we need to have and can go and try and fill that hole somewhere else.
Yeah, I agree. As far as I find it curious that they haven't at least reached out, because the number of bodies that they need to replace here, and Lugo was, quality pitcher for the most part for them, especially out of the bullpen. Like you said, it's not 2019 Seth Lugo, but definitely still more than serviceable. And for what the Mets need, you would think that they'd go after it. But a lot of pitchers out there that maybe they want to move on to something else. But before I put a bow on this, another trade piece, just throwing it out there hypothetically, obviously. I'm wondering what you would think, and I don't know if this is more if they pivot in case DeGrom leaves, but there's a pitcher in Milwaukee who won a Cy Young a couple years ago who's real good, Corbin Burns. Again, this is me just kind of speculating, something to think about. I'm wondering if you guys think that they could get a package together for someone like him, and without throwing in a Francisco Alvarez, something like that, which obviously we would assume would never happen because he's going to be untouchable. But I'm just curious if you think that the Mets would be able to get away with some sort of package, not named San Francisco Alvarez, to get a Corbin Burns type to kind of anchor the rotation with Scherzer if things go south with DeGrom. Mike, I'm going to start with you. We'll change it up.
So are you talking Corbin Burns and a David Stearns package? Is that what we're talking about?
That would be lovely, but I'm not going to get my hopes up too much, because then we might have to wait till 2035, like my joke always says. But yeah,
no, I mean, yeah, I mean, if Corbin Burns is available, I'm sure the Mets will call, especially if they already missed out on DeGrom. I mean,
right.
They're obviously going to want to trade him, but I mean, again, you're going to have a tough time. The Mets system's improved, but I mean, once you get outside of Alvarez, Beatty, Parada, and a couple other guys, I mean, it's just not, in terms of getting that type of arm on that type of deal. You're going to have to trade Beatty. Beatty's going to be in that trade. It'll be Beatty and more in that trade, and that's just a reality of the Mets system. Is that after the first like 3 or 4 guys, they're decent prospects, and they've improved on what the Mets have had in the past. I think their 1 through like 20 right now is much deeper than it was a couple of years ago. But there's not a whole lot of trade value there. I mean, even we've seen it with last trade deadline with Ronnie Mauricio and Mark Vientos, 2 of those guys that Mets fans really thought were, hey, this is where we're going to trade these guys and get those big pieces that we needed. And that's just not where Major League Baseball, that's not where other teams see those 2 guys. And that we're talking about like the Mets, depending on who you're talking to, like the Mets number 5 and number 7 prospect. So the fact that they don't have that type of value to get a good starter, it's obviously that kind of limits what you can do on the trade market for an arm like Burns. Obviously, that'd be a great get for the Mets. But once the issue you have is if he becomes available, is that other teams, if you're saying, say, for instance, the Mets are not trading Alvarez and not trading Beatty, then pretty much any other team can match what you're offering just because they have those type of prospects that are in the mid like hundreds or whatever, which it would be Parada next. He's like around 50, 65 in that range. So the Mets would have difficulty pulling off trades for guys like that. And I'm just not sure that's what the Brewers are ultimately going to do. But I mean, they traded Josh Hader, so who knows really what their long-term plans are.
Yeah. And it's, I agree with what Mike said, and it's not just prospects that teams are looking for, and it kind of seems like it's increased over recent years just how much teams are looking at major leaguers who are early in their pre-arbitration controllable years, guys that you can have for multiple years. Case in point, I don't think the Lindor trade gets done at all without Andres Jimenez. A guy who was coming off his first year in the majors. Pretty sure he just had, he had a full year of service time from that season. So, you have him for 5 more seasons, and you have a guy who you can plug in right away and have that leeway to develop them. And the Mets just don't have those guys at all. I mean, I think Tyler McGill is probably like the top early pre-arb guy that they have, and that's just not really a guy who, based on this past year with all his injuries, is not a guy who's going to be highly sought after to headline a trade in lieu of a top prospect. Like the Mets were able to get Lindor and Carrasco without giving up one of their elite prospects because they had someone like Jimenez who was early in his pre-arb years. And you would have been nice for someone like Mark Vientos to become that guy this year. It's just, they didn't make the move to call him up. So he kind of languished in the minors and then was kind of, up and down in his short stint in the majors. So, I don't think they have anything close to what other teams could offer for a guy like Burns, but like Mike said, if he's available, you call and you see what the deal is, and I think any team would be lucky to have someone like him on the roster.
Well, and to Jacob's point, even further, because it's like he's talking about with McGill, and then Peterson would be another guy, but less service time. But the Mets aren't going to want to trade pitching either. So then you go to, who on the depth chart fits that from a position player level, and there's no one. there's literally no one, because like you said, Vantos didn't come up. He didn't do much at the major league level, but we're talking about like a 30 at bat span, not the type of experience that Jimenez got. I mean, then Dom Smith is a guy that the Mets have tried trading, and now he's essentially in a couple of days probably not going to be a Met. I mean, he's a prime non-tender candidate, so he's not there. I mean, the guy, the like tradable position player piece they have in that like regard is Vogelback. And obviously he doesn't have like the control that you'd be looking for, but I could see a scenario where he ends up getting traded for an arm. I mean, that could happen. I mean, that's the same type of move the Mets were looking to do with Smith last offseason, was that same type of deal. So Vogelback, but yeah, again, Vogelback, I mean, realistically, Vogelback would be a type of guy that you would like to get the Rays interested in. They just traded G-Man Choi. Vogelback's a cheaper guy that they could plug in first base DH, and he could get you that depth arm. But that's what you have from a position player standpoint that we're talking about, is you're getting a depth arm, and that's the best you can really do with that. So the Mets are in kind of a tough spot when they're in trades. I mean, more likely with the Rays, they heavily scout the bottom of the minor leagues, like the DSL and the FCL. I mean, you're looking at some of the guys that kind of stand out there from the Mets prospects, like Jesus Baez, who had a big year for them and was ranked 13th from Baseball Prospectus. I had him in my top 30, and there's a couple of arms from down in those levels too. So, I mean, that's the type of team. Those are the type of guys that are going to get you a pitcher from like the Rays too, is those lower level prospects that the Mets have kind of undervalued. It's been a huge talking point going back like 10 years, how undervalued the Mets have kind of self-scouted at the bottom of their system. But I think, and we've talked a lot on the show and praised the Mets in a lot of good ways, but I think they still did that at this deadline. They still undervalued some of their lower level guys with Jose Acuna, Hector Rodriguez, Carson Seymour. And so it'll be interesting to see if they do make a trade with the Rays. I mean, you always, from a prospect, someone who follows prospects, you always get kind of nervous when you're talking about trading with the Rays, because they're so good at getting talent back. They're so good. Because, I mean, this is what they do. 2 or 3 years, they rifle guys in and out. So they have to be. I mean, that's what they have to do, is be so good at scouting and so good at projecting these players. So when you're talking about trading with the Rays, you get nervous, like, oh, you hear they like that guy. It's just like, well, of course they do, because that's really good. And hopefully your team doesn't undervalue them. So it'll be interesting to see what the Mets do. It'll be good. It'll be interesting to see what the Rays do this first step, and if the Mets are able to get a depth piece there, and that'll kind of take the Mets into their next station of their off season, which I do think is Dom Smith. I think they non-tender him. It's just, I think that's the reality of the situation that the Mets are in right now. And the next deadline, so we'll transition right to Jacob. His article on Metsmerized last week is the Rule 5, and the deadline to protect players is tomorrow. So who do you think that they end up protecting, Jacob?
Well, I'll preface this by saying the Mets have definitely had years in which they have more candidates to be added. They've they added 4 guys last year. They've added around 4 guys, in years in the past. They've also had years where they add absolutely no one. I think there's a significant chance that they don't add anyone. It would not shock me at all if they don't make any ads. It's kind of a shame because they have so much room on their 40-man roster. I think I saw, as of like right now, before the teams like the Rays open up their spots, the Mets have the most open spots on their 40-man roster. It's at 31 right now. So theoretically, if they had they had a lot of guys that they wanted to add, they could do that no problem. but Jake Mangum's the top guy that people have talked about, and the top guy that kind of fits the bill of someone you'd want to protect from the draft. But like, it's really interesting just kind of examining his case, because you could make a lot of points for adding him. You could make a lot of points against adding him. I mean, we can start with the positives first. Like, he's just kind of a solid, contact speed glove guy. And, just as someone who they've developed within the system, they just don't have a ton of those guys who, like, you can squint and see him being a major league contributor. He's added a little more power to his game. I wouldn't say his power tool is anywhere near average. It's still probably a 40-45. But that's from being a 25-30, coming into his pro career. So he's added the power. He makes pretty solid swing decisions, I'd say. But he just kind of puts the bat on the ball and uses his speed to turn gappers into doubles and triples, and obviously uses that speed in the outfield as well. I mean, it's a surefire best defensive outfielder in the system, and we saw it in the corners and center field this past year. So kind of a similar skill set to Brandon Nimmo. Even Mangum's a switch hitter. Definitely less power than Nimmo has now, but Nimmo kind of grew into that power. I definitely disagree with people who are like, yeah, you have to add Mangum as insurance for Nimmo leaving. Like, it just doesn't work like that, because you can sign guys and trade for guys that can fill that spot a lot better than Mangum would. Like, if they're going into opening day next year and Jake Mangum's starting center field, like, that's not exactly what you want. Unless there have been a ton of injuries. He's also going to be 27 on opening day next year, and he's just not a prospect in the sense of, like, he's 22 years old and he's made the upper minors and he's way ahead of schedule. Like, he's like I said, he'll be 27 on opening day, and like, teams tend to value in the Rule 5 draft guys that they can take and kind of develop along during the season. Obviously, they have to keep them on the major league roster so that someone you want to develop on the roster throughout the season. Whereas you can find 27-year-olds on the minor league free agent market who can pretty much do what Mangum does. So it's not a slam dunk ad by any means. It would not shock me if he does get added. But it wouldn't shock me if he's not. So I disagree with people who are like, yeah, you have to no doubt add Jake Mangum. Big fan of him and his game. He's not kind of in that upper echelon of prospects. And then, yeah, like, if he's the number one guy you're looking at adding, there's not really much after that. I think, Daniel Nunez, we've talked about, me and Mike. He actually was taken when the Mets left him unprotected 2 years ago, coming off the pandemic season, by the Giants. He was a starter at the time, needed Tommy John surgery, came back to the Mets. Now he's a reliever. And then after that, you're looking at, kind of raw younger guys like Stanley Consuegra, William Lugo, who, are not really at risk of getting taken. So it's so funny, because we make a lot about this day, as people who follow prospects and the team and roster building and all of that. Like, the Rule 5 protection deadline is a big thing, but at the end of the day, it is going to be super impactful, especially this year for the Mets. I like I said, wouldn't shock me if it's a quiet Tuesday for the Mets.
Yeah. Like you said, typically the Mets have, like, you're looking at like 1 or 2, 3, 4 guys that are top 15 prospects that, like, there's some definite ads, and then there's some like, well, should they add this guy? I mean, like, Bryce Montes de Oca was kind of going to be in that position. Had he not been called up, he was going to be in that position of, should they add him? I think
Alvarez and Beatty too. Like it was shaping up to be a big year for Rule 5, and then they kind of spoiled it by adding those guys during the season anyway.
Yeah, and so I mean, yeah, I think they end up probably adding Mangum just because they don't have a ton of outfield depth on the major league roster, and then in AAA, I mean, a guy like Khalil Lee who's just completely fallen out of favor within the Mets and within baseball. I mean, they tried to trade him pretty hard at the deadline, and just teams didn't see the value that the Mets wanted to get. And so, yeah, I mean, Mangum can provide you. I think Janikowski is a kind of similar player. I mean, obviously Mangum's a switch hitter, but I think Janikowski, he kind of gives you that same type of speed defense. That's what Mangum is. So, yeah, I think they add him just because of the depth or lack of depth in the outfield end, because, I mean, obviously they're going to fill a lot of these 40-man spots simply by signing the players that they have to, but going into it with 31, and there's a couple of guys, 3 or 4 guys you could still see there's some wiggle room there, guys that are DFA candidates. So yeah, after that, like the names you mentioned, I like William Lugo quite a bit. I like Stanley Consuego quite a bit. They're both in my top 30. They're probably both should be in my top 20. I know Consuego was, so I like these guys, but we're talking about guys that have only a little bit of experience at Brooklyn, high A Brooklyn. So to see them getting picked by anyone, even if they're unprotected, is pretty unrealistic. You touched on it. I think Nunez, if you don't protect him, he was hitting 98, 99 this year as a reliever. So I think he could get picked again, which is kind of crazy, but I think he's the type of guy that teams are looking for, those type of arms, hard thrower, and you just hope you can make one little switch and then become a big league reliever. So yeah, it doesn't have that big shiny prospects or prospects anymore, but it's one of those things that I have an irrational love for, just because one of my first articles at Mets Mirage was writing about the Rule 5, and I highlighted Sean Gilmartin as a player that the Mets should draft, and we know what happened there. The Mets drafted him, and he was actually a pretty important part of a bullpen that ended up going to the World Series. So, I mean, that's the thing that's always struck me, is that you can essentially find a little bit of value in the Rule 5 for pretty much nothing. You're talking about a roster spot. That's really all it is.
Yeah, no, you guys are the Rule 5 experts, the prospects experts there, but just listening to you go back and forth with everything, I'll leave it at this. It's more of kind of a rhetorical statement, but, with so much turnover this year, the roster, and, Rear's also the farm system. And Mike, we've talked a lot about how the Mets have improved so much, right, with their farm depth and just kind of the philosophy and the things that they're doing. But when it comes down to nuts and bolts trading, we're talking now, and they don't really have the depth for it. So with everything going on, I know Cohen would never admit it, and as fans, we didn't want to hear anything about it. But I'm curious at this point if he's a little regretful that he didn't do more of the traditional route as far as coming in, buying a team, not necessarily breaking everything down, but breaking it down in the sense that you may going to get rid of some pieces, trade some pieces that you don't think are going to be here long term, rebuild the farm system, build it up from the bottom up. I'm just thinking out loud as one. I know he's a guy that doesn't like to lose, and whatever he does, he wants it to be the best, and that's why we're excited as fans that he bought the team. But I'm wondering now, with all the turnover that's happening, if he was a little regretful now as not going as far as going that more traditional route. But hopefully things go well with the guys that they protect in the Rule 5. We'll see what happens with the rest of free agency. To
kind of touch on that real quick, and as a conversation I had with someone recently, and it's something Mets fans have talked about this offseason, even with all the free agents, is extending guys like Pete Alonso,
right.
Jeff McNeil. I think that's where Steve Cohen kind of, if you asked him like what his big regret to this point probably is not being more aggressive in signing guys to extensions earlier, so we're not at this point right now. So like if they had signed Brandon Nimmo to an extension earlier, if they had figured something else out to keep DeGrom longer. I know DeGrom wanted to talk to the Mets about doing that, and it kind of didn't come. So it'll be interesting to see what the Mets do going forward in that aspect, because I do think Cohen probably regrets not getting some extensions done previously. I know that's a tough thing to just kind of walk into, right, especially right, with the weird turnover they've had at GM. But yeah. So it'll be interesting to see going forward if that's something that he focuses on more. Because, I mean, we've seen it with the Braves. They have good young players that come up, play well, and then they pay them. So, I mean, these guys are playing on ridiculously cheap deals, and that's going to help the Braves move to build that team long-term going forward. They're not going to have to spend as much as some of the other teams because they've got that foundation at a really good price. So hopefully that's something that Cohen and Epler and whoever else is in the front office focuses on going forward. I mean, say Alvarez starts next year, starts in the big leagues, and he starts well. So you're like, yeah, this is definitely our catcher of the future. Lock him up. Get it done. Lock him up. Same with Beatty. He's that type of player too. I mean, he's a top 20 prospect. If he comes up and does well and you think he's going to be that guy, get him a cheap deal done. That's the type of stuff that if he really wants to be the Dodgers of the East or that stuff, you have to, it's more than just throwing your money at free agents. You got to get your own players here long term and at better deals than free agent deals too. So
yeah, and to quickly to that point, just on the Braves, it helps when every play you sign like takes on the market value on pennies on the dollar, and you can do that with all your prospects and stuff. And other teams get that luxury, but the Braves, it seems everyone buys into the organization, which is really annoying. We get that for the Mets. But no, I hear you. It is unfortunate with Alonso McNeil, especially. That would have been something nice at the beginning of last year for them to do. Obviously, Nimmo's a different story. Nimmo would have been great too. But with those guys, McNeil having his big bounce back here and Alonso just proving he's one of the, continues to be one of the elite power hitters in the game. You wonder the next couple of years when they become free agents how that's going to go. But yeah, no, hopefully things of that nature, Cohen will get a little smart with. You want to keep the guys out of here, like you said. Teams like the Dodgers, the Braves, they do that with their core. So. It's all a learning process for him. He's a new owner and stuff. Like you said, it's a weird thing to come into a new business that you just bought without, sight unseen and doing that kind of stuff. But, it's live and learn. Hopefully they can retain most of this core, whether it's the free agents this year and then beyond the players that they have. But it'll be a stressful winter. That's all I keep thinking about. It's going to be stressful. Hopefully it'll be fun for the most part. But it's always cool when the Mets are, these conversations are happening. The Mets are in on all this. It's a lot different than we're used to over years past. So, that's a plus there.
We're talking about Justin Verlander and Carlos Rondon and Trey Turner and all these guys. We're not talking about I don't know, like Michael Wacha, who's a free agent, and like David
Porcello, baby.
Yeah, it's just at least in this era where you're talking about the upper echelon, like it'd be a shock if the Mets weren't involved in this big free agent or this big free agent. Like that's where we are. We're not talking about all the bottom tier guys. Like we're talking about Taijuan Walker, signing him as like the Mets number 5. I mean, 5-6 years ago, Taijuan Walker, I mean, he could be an ace on some Mets teams, some Wilpon Met teams. So yeah, it's exciting, stressful, but also exciting that we're talking about them potentially replacing all these guys with similar to better talented guys.
Yeah. And notice we didn't even bother Jacob about any Trey Turner talk. I didn't even bother you about the new rules. I think that's something we're going to get to as the offseason comes. We're going to institute all that and explain the new rules. But listen, I think we'll put a capper here. We don't want to keep Jacob all night. Thank you so much for coming on again. At this point, you're like a bi-weekly guest here. You're family of the show at this point. But thanks a lot. And everyone else, stay tuned next week for the latest on free agency, the Rule 5 draft, everything else. Hopefully it's all positive, but whatever it is, we'll keep you updated. Until then, let's go Mets.